Right now, the reality is most elections in Idaho are decided in the Republican primary. Like I said, I'm from Madison County, District 34. We have not had a contested general election in a decade. And had we had a contested general election, it wouldn't have been close. There's a reason people aren't running as Democrats or as independents. The reality is most people in Madison County do identify with the Republican Party.
God bless it. Hyrum, thank you for coming, sir.
Than's for having me.
Yeah, no problem.
Excited to be here.
You drove all the way from Rexburg, is that correct?
I did.
Gosh, look at you. You are a member of the party precinct committeeman, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a precinct committeeman in District 34.
Fantastic.
Madison County.
You and I got connected because I got a hold of some people for Reclaim Idaho, because I've spoken with Jake Ball and I've spoken with Commissioner Rod Beck, and they obviously are not for Prop 1. They're not interested in open primaries and they're not interested in ranked choice voting. And it has been very difficult to connect with somebody that would be willing to come on and say, okay, look, these are the benefits. And I got connected with you, and I'm so happy you're here to just explain this huge, huge thing. Because again, it's very difficult to get a clear understanding of why this is something that you feel and other people feel that Idaho deeply needs and is really important. So have at it, man. Let's hear it.
So I think in order to understand why I support this as strongly as I do, it helps to back up and understand what the problem that we're fixing is. Right now, the reality is most elections in Idaho are decided in the Republican primary. Like I said, I'm from Madison County, District 34. We have not had a contested general election in a decade. And had we had a contested general election, it wouldn't have been close. There's a reason people aren't running as Democrats or as independents. The reality is most people in Madison County do identify with the Republican Party. And what that means is that the primary is the election where leaders are chosen. And in District 34, that means that our state senator and our 2 House seats are decided in that primary election. The problem with that is that there are a lot of independents. There are people that don't want to identify as Republicans or Democrats. There are members of the Constitutional Party, there are libertarians, and there are Democrats in Madison County. And they don't get to participate in those elections.
Now, if I may, okay, because again, there's a large commentary saying, hey, independents, unaffiliated, and Democrats are not being shut out of the primaries. You can have a Democrat running the primary. Independents, unaffiliated, obviously go straight to the general. So like they don't even have to worry. Like if there's an unaffiliated candidate, that candidate goes straight to the general. So they're not actually being shut out of anything. And there's the nuance that if you are on an unaffiliated voter, you can roll into the primary and choose a party day of. So because of that, people are saying that they're not being shut out.
So I think there's a couple of responses to that. One is there is a large segment of people in Idaho for whom the requirement that they must join a party in order to vote is simply unacceptable. It's not that they can't join a party. It's not that they don't know how. It's that they don't want to, and they feel it in their gut. They are not joiners. They are independents. They're not Republicans. They're not Democrats. They're going to vote for whoever they think the best candidate is, and they have no interest in joining a party. And I do not understand why we would want to create a system that requires those people to do that. I think that is a mindset that has value, that is very fundamentally Idahoan, that we should recognize and support. I'm a Republican. I like my party. I've been a member my entire life, but that doesn't mean that my brother needs to be or that my neighbor needs to be. And they should still be able to vote. The other response to that is that it's not the fact that an independent candidate would proceed directly to the general does not solve the problem that my neighbor that is an independent voter still does not get input in who comes out of that Republican election that will, in reality, decide who's going to win.
MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.
Election.
Okay. And this is actually, what you just said is something I've heard from a couple other people, that it's like, look, it doesn't matter, like the participation usually in the primary is inconsequential as an independent and as a Democrat, because the only people that actually have consequence, if we acknowledge that in the general election in November, let's say 90%, I'm just going to put a number on it. I'm sure I'm off on that, but let's say 90% of the time, if there's an R next to the name, if whoever the Republican is, that person will win, because the populace is not going to go for the Democrat or the independent. And that means that the only people that have the input on that R are the people back in the primary. So it's not that the Democrats can't vote for their Democratic candidate. And it's not that the unaffiliated can't join the party, as you're saying. That's not an appropriate requirement that we put on people, because people aren't joiners. But it's that fundamentally the only people that have control over who's in the R in the general are the R's in the primary. And that's the early vote that happens, obviously, in the spring.
Right. And that has a couple of consequences. One of them is that it incentivizes a lot of people who would not otherwise join the Republican Party, that don't feel any particular allegiance to it or may not agree with it. It encourages those people to join the party. And if you look at the numbers from before the primary was closed to now, the Republican Party has almost doubled in size as a percentage of the total voters. And to the point that today, between 59-60% of registered voters in Idaho are registered as Republicans. And some of those people are not Republicans. They don't feel Republican. They don't agree with Republican values. They just want to vote. And I would suggest, as a Republican, that is not healthy for the party. And that's a different argument than it's bad for the state or anything else. That's just me looking at my party, suggesting that forcing all of these people into it is not a good idea. And one of the responses to this proposition is people can just then vote, join the Republican Party. Just join the party, then you get to vote. And I don't understand why we would, as Republicans, think that is a good idea.
Why is it a bad idea?
Well,
and again, I know you articulated, like, look, there are
sure.
a lot of people that aren't Republicans, but like, what's the consequence of that?
Well, I think a political party exists because it is a group of people who have decided that they're going to unite around interests or around ideas or around principles. And they're going to use this as a way to advance candidates for elections. When that group gets too big, and I would suggest 60% of all of the voters in Idaho is pushing on that door, you lose that cohesiveness. You lose any consistency. And I think if you look at the Republican Party right now, it's not hard to see that there is wide variance within the party as to their approach to government. And part of that, and there's always that tension.
Sure.
But it is exacerbated right now by the fact that everybody is joining it in order to influence these closed Republican primaries.
So the nature of the Republican title is becoming significantly diluted.
Yes.
Not delusional, but literally like it's becoming watered down.
Right. And on both sides. There are a lot of people right now that are in the Republican Party that historically would be much more comfortable in the Libertarian Party or the Constitutional Party. And similarly, there are a lot of people that would be independent or maybe lean Democrat that are in the Republican Party because they recognize the importance practically of those primary elections. And it is not a healthy place for a party to be. And this moving away from a closed Republican primary will mean that everyone that doesn't want to be a Republican can then leave. And I think a lot of people will.
Okay, so the party becomes less meaningful because you have people that don't want to be in the party existing there. And then you also have the problem in the primary that a smaller portion of registered voters get to choose who goes to the general for the Republicans. And that it's my understanding that people feel that has created a problem over the last like 12 or 13 years, however long it's been, that needs to be addressed. Like, what's the problem we're actually in?
So I've described one of them from the perspective of the party.
Yes.
Let me give you another one from the perspective of the state as a whole.
Great.
It is that the only people that are picking those leaders are the people that show up in the Republican primary. And you have to remember that that's not even all the registered Republicans. It's the registered Republicans that are showing up in that non-presidential, relatively low turnout primary election. So not only have we shrunk the number of relevant voters down to just Republicans, we've now shrunk it down again to Republicans who will show up in that primary election. In 2024, it was just under 207,000 total voters, which is about 35% of the registered Republicans. That means that is 20% of all the registered voters in Idaho. And what that means is that if 20% of the registered voters of Idaho are deciding most of the relevant races, that means you can win with 11% of the registered voters. And that varies from district to district, but that's your average. That is a remarkably small sliver of my neighbors and your neighbors that are making those incredibly consequential decisions for the entire state. That has a couple of consequences. One of them is it allows special interest groups to focus their attention just on those voters. They don't have to deal with the independents. They don't have to deal with the libertarians, the Constitutional Party. They can focus just on the Republicans that show up at the primary, which means that they can have a lot of bang for their buck. Because in these districts, that's not that many people. And you may not have the money to spend throughout the entire state, but you can target that one slice, and your impact will be greatly outsized.
If I may, I actually recently Secretary of State Phil McGrain has a feature on the Vote Idaho, I believe it's Vote Idaho website, the Secretary of State's website, where he breaks down all the state, including campaign spending. And he was showing me that the money spent for candidates like Chuck Winder or I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he beat Chuck Winder, Kaiser, I believe. I can't remember I didn't get to meet him in person. But for instance, in those types of races, you had a certain amount of money for each candidate, but then the amount of money that was against Chuck Winder or, for instance, Speaker of the House Mike Moyle, the amount of money that went against him was literally 3 to 4 times the amount of money that they were spending. So we're talking like $30,000 to $120,000 of attack ads. And so they weren't even running campaigns based on, let's build up this other person, let's articulate benefits of this alternate person. They were saying, hey, let's run attack ads. I mean, people talk, they were like legendary, like stacks of mailers this high that were literally just all of these wild attack ads against people. So what you're talking about, it's like $100,000, just throw it and just like run these insane attack campaigns.
And you can target it because you know exactly who the people most likely to show up at the Republican primary are. And you know what your argument needs to be. And they are, for the most part, those type of attack ads are just garbage.
Right.
They do not reflect reality. And you had some very conservative legislators who are to my right being attacked as being leftists.
Right. Did you ever see the Fauci marionette ones where it was like Chuck Winder's a marionette and Fauci's over him? Or there was one against Mike Moyle, and it was like he's anti-Second Amendment. And as the story goes, he's like, I was talking to somebody, the person he was chatting with as it came out was telling me, he was like, Mike literally just reached into his car and held up his AR. He was like, what do you mean I'm anti-Second? Like, what are you talking? So to your point, it not reality.
Bizarre.
Right.
But because they know precisely who they're talking to, they're able to do that, and that does have some efficacy. And it doesn't matter whether I like that candidate or don't like that candidate. The elections should be reality based. And right now, sometimes they're not. And that's not a healthy thing for the state as a whole. The other thing that it does, the closed primary, is that it pulls the entire Republican Party and, as a consequence, the entire state to the right. And the reason for that is because if you're a representative in most districts, all you need to be reelected is to win the Republican primary, which means that the only people that you need to talk to are the Republican primary voters. Now, I know the three, our senator, and I know our state senator, and I know our 2 representatives in District 34. They talk to everybody. They will listen to everybody. But the reality is that's just because they're nice people. From a political standpoint, my neighbor who's an independent, or my good friend who's a Democrat and refuses to register as a Republican because he feels like he's lying about it if he does, they don't matter. And their opinion does not affect the outcome of an election in District 34. And that's not a value judgment. That's just the hard, basic political reality in most districts in Idaho. Not all of them, but in most of them. And that means that those voters who are showing up and who are voting in the Republican primary have an outsized voice. That's me.
And again, I think if I'm understanding you, you're saying, look, because of that, they're only talking to the Republicans that vote in the primary, And if you have two people competing against each other, they want to out like conservative each other.
That is exactly right.
And you saw, I actually saw this in the Eagle election, which I thought was very fascinating. Again, I don't live in Eagle, so I'm kind of watching it removed like, wow, this is crazy what's happening, because both people said, I'm the true conservative.
Right.
And you came down to a conflict of principle, for instance, with policing. One person wanted to determine the level of policing based on geography. Like, hey, we just annexed in a large portion. We should increase our police, our contract with the Ada County Sheriff's Office and have more police presence, right? Because they got to go up to this place called Avamore and come back. Great. The other person said, hey, we should have the number of police that's based on need for service. So, like, we don't have that much crime, so we shouldn't increase spending. Now, I don't see where either one of those policies is more or less conservative. Sure. Both want to support police. They just want to judge policing, need for policing on different things. And both people were like, I'm the conservative one.
Right.
Which is, again, so you keep that mantra of I'm the true conservative, which is something that somebody recently said in an interview. They're like, real conservatives support the party 100% and never waver.
Right.
It's like, wow. That's kind of crazy, considering the platform is pretty charged.
Highly flexible. Well,
yeah.
and it's changed.
Right.
And it will change again. And then 2 years after that, it'll change again. And that's just the nature of platforms. They are a creation of the party, and they exist in a time when they were created. And that can't be that can't be the touchstone for what it means to be a Republican, because then those people that agree with our current platform weren't Republicans 10 years ago when our platform said something different. So those are the problems that I see primarily coming from the closed Republican primary. It is artificially polling the party to the right, polling the state to the right. It artificially enlarges the Republican Party, which isn't healthy for it. And I can't say this enough. It is incredibly unfair to people who don't want to register with a party. And party registration is public record. If my neighbor's an independent, a Democrat, or Republican, I can find that out. It's there. And there's a lot of people that it's none of anybody's business who I vote for. And you ask me what party I belong to, I don't belong to any party, and you can pound sand, which it's not my attitude, but it's an entirely reasonable one that I'm pretty sympathetic to. There was one more.
A different question, though. Some people have articulated, look, maybe there's an imbalance, but the state's going in the right direction, so I don't care. And I have heard other people say, yeah, look, the state's mostly going in the right direction, but that's primarily because of the heavy lifting that the moderate people in the legislature are really going through, which is they're fighting against different factions and different, more right groups of people that are, in their words, voting no to everything. They don't want to fund anything. They don't care about the budget, and their obligation is really just to rating systems. And they're like, I don't care about anything. I'm going to get an A+ in this rating system. And then the rest of the people who are more moderate and functional have to go then and become unpopular because they're like, look, we got to pass a budget that like funds, law enforcement. We got to pass a budget that funds this stuff. Like we got to pass a budget. We can't just vote no to anything that comes across the table. Again, where does this factor into that? Because again, some people are saying that everything's fine, and then other people are saying it's only fine because of the moderate people that are taking it on the chin.
So I think that one of the things that this closed Republican primary has created is a disconnect between the majority of Idaho voters who are conservative and a significant minority of our legislators. And the way you can tell is that in the last few years, you've had a number of initiatives that have been successful and that have passed, or in the case of the education initiative, would have passed with overwhelming voter support that could not and were not going to get out of the legislature. They weren't, because while these were initiatives and ideas that were popular with the Idaho voters as a whole, they weren't popular enough with Republican primary voters. So they weren't going to get out of the legislature.
And again, the Republican primary, you generally only need to get about 11% of the registered voters.
Right.
So you really just cater to that 11% as hard as you can. The other 89% be damned.
That's right.
Well, that's a little aggressive. No, I shouldn't say be damned.
Sure. But they are largely irrelevant. If you can get, again, Idaho is conservative. The voters are conservative. But they're also highly practical. And the Idaho Republican Party has a long history of practical problem-solving conservatism. And if you look at who our governors have been over the last couple decades, you don't see ideologues. You see problem solvers. And I don't love the initiative process. I am somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of direct democracy. I do think that we have elected representatives. We are a constitutional republic. We have elected representatives whose job it is to understand the issues and to go serve in these bodies and pass good laws. But in Idaho, the initiative process serves as a pressure release valve. And when the legislature starts to get too disconnected from the voters, you start to see these initiatives bubble up. And there's a reason. I'm not a member of Reclaim Idaho, never have been, but there's a reason they've been so successful over the last few years. And it's because they have tapped in to this disconnect created by this Republican primary. This was not a thing 15 years ago. It is a thing now because of the separation that we're seeing between Idaho voters that are conservative, but not primarily ideologically driven. But a disproportionate number of Republican primary voters are, and they care very much about some of these wedge issues that I have never heard any of my neighbors bring up.
Could you give me an example? Sorry to put you on the spot here.
Sure. I have never heard any of my neighbors complain that they are concerned that librarians in Madison County are providing porn to elementary school-aged kids. I am sure there's somebody in my county for whom this is top of mind. And I agree, libraries shouldn't provide porn to kids. But the amount of attention that issue has received in the legislature over the past 2-3 sessions is completely out of whack for the amount of headspace it takes up for people in Idaho. Now, not for registered Republican primary voters. You might be able to get, if that's where you're going to focus, you may be able to get squeezed through a Republican primary with that be your primary issue. But most voters in the county just don't view that as the primary thing that they're going to be focused on.
And so, again, just putting it all together, then it sounds like the real, or not the real, but one of the primary problems is that this type of election system where we have a primary, we're already leaning R, we're getting driven more artificially, pulled to the right more as a state, it nullifies any importance that anybody outside of that primary Republican voter has, and the legislature then caters to some degree. If they want to get reelected, if they have any hope of getting or any desire to get reelected, they cater to the primary Republican voters and whatever issues those voters think about, which is, again, you only need 11% of the entire registered population. So whatever issues are really important to the 89%, the legislators might know about these things and understand that they are important to that 89%, but they know if they want to get reelected, they need to focus on that 11%.
And two things. One, I think it is worth noting that our legislature and our governor has been as effective as they have been over the past decade. Despite this, not because of it, but despite this, they're still doing a pretty good job, at least in my mind and to the mind of most voters in the state. They're sending them back. The other thing to note is that this is not a problem that is unique to Idaho. If you go to New York, they have a closed Democratic primary, and the exact same process plays itself out. Because if you are running in a closed Democratic primary in a city that is profoundly blue, then you are going to be running as far to the left as you can possibly get. Because you're not gonna get primaried by a moderate Democrat. You're gonna get primaried by some crazy communist person. So you run as far to the left as you can get. And what that does, that's part of the reason that Congress is, and by Congress I mean the United States Congress, is as ineffective as it is because you have Republicans beholden only to Republican primary voters and Democrats beholden only to Democratic primary voters. And we will punish them if they seek common ground. And given how split the country is, that makes it really hard to pass any meaningful legislation at a national level. And we could pick a dozen things that are broken with the federal government. And everybody agrees that they're broken. And yet Congress can't fix them. And this is at least part of the reason why.
Man, that's a dark but very clear reason. And so is this why, and again, look, I'm an idiot, so you gotta humor me here. So is this why you have fewer and fewer but more galvanizing issues? People talk so much about the border, right? And they're like, every state is a border state. And they're not talking about Canada. They're talking about, Mexico, right? And you have more and more people talking about that. And even in the face of Ada County Sheriff Matt Clifford saying, hey, I have fewer and fewer illegal aliens making it through my jail system. Just from quantitatively, I don't have as many people as, years past. And he also says, look, we have no recorded mass transportation of illegal immigrants here. We just do not. And if anybody has them, there was a big issue on Fairview and 5 Mile a few months back. Somebody posted a video of a bus and some Hispanic looking people standing outside China Buffet. Turns out Sheriff Clifford did call ICE and say, hey, can you go check out what's going on down at the China Buffet? ICE rolls up and they're like, hey guys, what's going on? And the people there say, hey, we are in transport to Oregon as H-2B visa workers. And by the way, here are all of our papers, right? So they had all the documentation. They literally stopped for dinner and were getting back on the bus to drive away. But that issue blew up and people lost their minds over it because of the anxiety that every state's this border state, even though from a functional, pragmatic standpoint, we don't have a problem with that. But you have people that are running on the platform of stop the illegal immigration, stop all these things. And meanwhile, the sheriff is going hey, we Like who? Like who do you want us to grab? What are you talking about?
And you can imagine a scenario where if I'm a candidate running in Portland or Seattle, I'm going to
God help you if you are.
I'm going to be focusing on the same thing, but I'm going to be doing it in reverse. I'm going to be talking about how Republicans are racist, how much they hate Mexicans and Nicaraguans, and how they want to kill people, and neither of those two narratives are based in reality. There is a reality, and there is a reality that we have an immigration system and a border problem that is profound and that has existed for decades, that we have been unable and unwilling as a country to address. We simply lack the political will to do it. And there are answers there, and there are smart people who understand how to do it. We lack the political will. And this is a significant portion of why.
And to be clear, what I'm saying about the China buffet and Sheriff Clifford, I'm not saying, like I spoke with Representative Ted Hill, and he went down to I think it's Eagle Pass down in Texas, and met with the he went all over the southern border in California, Texas, all over the place. And he was saying he went on multiple trips, and he said initially it was just horrific, and then Texas finally clamped down. They're like, hey, enough of this.
Right.
We're Texas, we're doing this. And he said when he returned, it was like 20 people a day or 30 people a day that were making across. Before it was 10,000, right? And he's like, that's a real problem. And he was hot.
Absolutely.
He was hot on recognizing that China has been providing the precursors to Mexico to make fentanyl. Yep. Fentanyl is getting distributed up and poisoning our population incredibly. He was a big driver, or actually he was the sponsor for the fentanyl bill this last year to make it all kinds of things. He's really hard on it, and he's very reality based, but he's also very pragmatic based, right? Anyway, the point is, because we have a decreasing number of illegal immigrants going through the 80 county jail system does not mean we don't have a national border problem. It just means that people running off of, hey, we have this emerging border problem in the state of Idaho. It's like, okay, I understand we have a national problem, but how does that factor into like Ada County? How does that factor in to Idaho in general?
But so our current system focuses on turning out registered Republicans. If you can convince Republicans that you are the most conservative candidate, and then you can get them to show up and vote for you, that's all you need to be able to win. And that strategy is employed regularly and effectively. It is in fact incentivized by this system, and unless we change the incentives, we will not change the behavior. It's politics in the United States does not suffer primarily from character flaws. It's not that politicians now are uniquely bad, and 100 years ago they were all good. It's not that we as Americans are somehow less than we were. We are, to a large extent, acting within the systems that we have created, and those create incentives. And right now in Idaho politics, the incentive is to run as far to the right as you possibly can, and to do everything you can to maximize your turnout for your people in that primary. And that means that you scare people, and that you inflame hatred and anger. And that is an effective strategy in this system. And again, it's not unique to Idaho. Anytime that you're in a state that is primarily dominated by one party, and that party has a closed primary, you will see that same behavior because it is incentivized by the system. It's not an Idaho problem. It's a systemic problem. And you see the same thing in reverse in New York and in other states.
Hyrum, listen, it's Labor Day. You very kindly made it all the way over here. You've answered a lot of questions. Is there anything we've missed?
Let me talk a little bit about the instant runoff.
Go. Yes, please.
The RCV portion of the proposition.
I'm so sorry. We haven't even chatted about that. And this was actually something that Commissioner Beck was saying, hey, look, people are going to talk about open primary. They're not going to talk about ranked choice voting. But again, ranked choice voting is the other half of this. So let's please cover that.
So one of the reasons that I strongly support the instant runoff, and an instant runoff and ranked choice voting, synonyms used to describe the same system, is because it incentivizes exactly the opposite of the behavior that we've been describing. And the reason for that is because in order to win, we've got a top four, you've got, assuming you have four candidates, you've got four candidates in your general election. In order to win, the winning candidate has to get 50% of the votes. And in order to do that, you not only need your small slice to love you, you also need other people not to hate you.
That's a great way of putting it.
So you can no longer run this type of a scorched earth campaign where I am the protector of all that is good and right, and everyone who disagrees with me is a communist. And I would suggest that is a healthy thing. There are a plentitude of issues upon which reasonable people can disagree. And we should express those disagreements clearly. Some of them should be vociferous. Because this stuff is important. It affects people's lives. Sometimes politics is literally life and death. But when there is a legitimate disagreement on policy, we should recognize it as such. Not that you are a bad person, not that you are a awful human being, but that we disagree. I think I'm right. I think you're wrong. And when you do that, you can get people that disagree with you that will say, you know what? Ted was my first choice, and he's the guy I want to have win. But if he's not available, Chris is not a bad option. We disagree on this thing over here. I like Ted better, but I'll still support Chris.
If I may, in Eagle, we don't have an instant runoff, right? But we do have a runoff system, or they do, because I don't live in Eagle. Right. But what you saw in 2023, you had 4 people running for mayor. Okay, so you had Stan Ridgway, he's a former mayor. You had Captain Mark, who I never got to meet, unfortunately. You had Jason Pierce, and you had Brad Pike. So you have 4 people, all right? And nobody got the 50+1 in the initial vote. So they dropped 2 of them, the lowest 2, that was Stan and Captain Mark. And then it was Brad Pike and Jason Pierce. Jason Pierce was the existing mayor at the time. What happened then was really interesting because you had about a month in between the first election and then the runoff election. To your point, where you're talking about, hey, the system right now incentivizes people to appeal to a very small number of voters. And in a different system, you'd appeal to a broader base of voters. In that interim, what you saw is Brad Pike did extend an olive branch out to, I believe, Stan Ridgway, who was at the time the president of the Eagle Senior Center. And they were running against each other. I interviewed them both. They both very much wanted to win.
Sure.
And then you had some of the issues where it was like, okay, we got to meet in the middle on this, or I got to figure out a way to you guys want this, and I wanted this other piece, and you guys wanted this piece, and maybe we meet in the middle. And Brad Pike did end up winning because he appealed to a broader base of people and understood what, or at least attempted to understand and figure out if there was a way to reconcile the problems between those two groups, right? The Stan Ridgway group and the Brad Pike group. And because of that, Brad Pike won. So again, not an instant runoff, but exactly what you're talking about, which is that incentivized him to appeal to a broader audience, and that gave him the victory. And then a broader portion of the voting population of Eagle got the person that they voted for. So again, the initial vote and then the runoff vote. So in this case, in the instant runoff, you just say to yourself, okay, who would I really like to win? This guy, right? Yep. Ted, whatever it is. And you're like, all right, but if Ted doesn't get it, who could be an okay second option? Then you just say, okay, that person. And in that case, if Ted doesn't win, then that second place vote, that goes over to the other guy that you voted for. And you do this until the person, somebody gets 50+1.
That's right. And not only does that allow us as voters to have additional input, because it means that if our guy doesn't win, we can still affect the outcome. It changes the incentives for the candidates. And that is a really big deal. And when you combine an open primary, so let's go back to District 34, sure. Right? Madison County. If you, allow everybody in the county, it just so happens that our county perfectly lines up with our congressional district. So District 34 is Madison County. Just mathematically just hit the sweet spot this last census. But that means that everybody in Madison County gets to vote. Everybody matters. And you overlay that with a change in incentives created by ranked choice voting in a general election, you can really impact politics in Idaho for the good in a extremely meaningful way. And I say that liking all three of our current elected officials. But it is, to my mind, the most important thing that Idaho has done in politics, certainly during my lifetime. And it does have the opportunity, and this isn't just in Idaho, but you overlay this with what's happening in Nevada, and I want to say there's like 5 states that are doing something similar, because this is a problem that exists in all of these states, and voters can see it, and you can feel it, and it's obvious if you're paying attention to the incentives and the behavior of politicians and why they are acting the way that they're acting. We can really make a difference and improve Idaho politics in a way that significantly improves the lives of Idahoans regardless of their politics. Because everybody should get to vote. Whether you agree with me or not, you should still get to vote. I should not be more powerful than my neighbor who doesn't want to register or who's a Democrat. And right now, that's not the case. I have massively outsized influence as a registered Republican than an independent in my county has.
Well, I can definitely tell you that from my experience in my former state, where my vote did not matter at all, that was not a very fun experience. And it definitely gave you a sense of you just kind of gave up on things, because again, it didn't matter. I was speaking to a friend just yesterday who's always been this very conservative guy. His dad ran cattle all over the hills in the Bay Area back when it was, farm and agriculture. And he was like, none of it matters. He's like, I write my check to the party, and I vote what seems right to me. Like, but it doesn't matter, and the world has just become so much more nonsensical in the time that he's been there, and just seeing his community over the last 40-ish years just dissolve into nothing. It's like, what is it, right? Yeah, that's not a good feeling. So I can sympathize at least to some degree with people that might be more left-wing here, saying
Sure.
like, well, look, I mean, nothing we do matters. I'm like, well, unless you live in Boise, that's true.
And it should matter. Now, I'm a conservative Republican. I think conservative Republicans are going to continue to win elections because that's where Idaho is. And if you put this to a vote, which is what it is, conservative Republicans will continue to win elections in Idaho. And we are better off when everybody is participating. Process does matter. And having everybody voting does matter. In some ways, as you describe your feelings coming out of California, in some ways, process can sometimes matter more than the outcome. Because if that process does not respect everybody, we stop talking to them. They stop showing up to vote. They stop engaging with the system. They stop listening to the arguments. I'm convinced that as Republicans, our arguments are good. And when we make them, and we make them well, grounded in reality, most of my friends and neighbors will be right on board with us. If we continue to focus not on Idahoans as a whole, but just on that narrow slice, that does not bode well for the Idaho Republican Party in the long term.
Why is that?
Because at some point we lose all of my friends and neighbors. Because if the party continues to move further and further to the right and be more focused on wedge issues rather than the real issues that most Idahoans are concerned about, and you do that in order to activate those Republican primary voters, we're going to start to lose general elections. And you actually have seen that. I want to say 2008 in the congressional district that includes North Idaho and part of Boise, because Boise splits it. Republicans ended up nominating a Republican candidate that was unpalatable to the majority of voters. And Idaho sent a Democrat to Congress because the Republican Party was so focused that they were so focused on that Republican primary that they did not nominate a good candidate. And if we continue to focus just on our closed primary, that's going to happen more and more often.
There's a lot.
There is a lot.
There is a lot. Okay, so we covered it. Ranked choice voting, open primary. I think we solved all the problems, Hyrum.
Good.
That's good. This is happening in November. People will have an opportunity to vote for this. Prop 1. I'm hoping to talk to at least one more person about this because, again, I talked to two people that were very concerned about Prop 1. You're obviously in favor of Prop 1. I'm hoping to do an independent video as well, just kind of explaining this in a much more succinct manner. But I really appreciate you. Thank you for what you're doing. You obviously care very deeply about Idaho and the Republican Party. And again, for people like me who just have no idea what's going on, your input and explanation is invaluable.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Have you on again, maybe. Maybe we should do another one afterwards. We'll do it remote so you don't have to drive it. But we do another one afterwards and talk about the fallout. Whatever it is, it'd be wild. Fantastic. Thanks, sir. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Thank you.
MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.